Hi, I'm Anjali Alapat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and sci-fi for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In this first series, I'm going to be talking to 6 celebrated writers of speculative fiction from South Asia to find out what really made them want to tell stories. Today, we're in conversation with Indra Das, author, critic, and editor. Indra's work crosses genres and creates intricate worlds. His writing is exploratory, fresh, and fantastical. The Devourers, his debut novel, was published in 2015 to critical acclaim. The same year, he was shortlisted for the Shakti Bhatt First Book Prize. In 2016, he was shortlisted for the Crawford Prize, and in 2017, he won the Lambda Literary Award for the Best LGBTQ Science Fiction, Fiction and Horror. Indra's short fiction has been featured in publications like Strange Horizons, Clarksworth Magazine, Lightspeed Magazine, Tor.com, and Asimov Science Fiction Magazine, to name a few. Hi, Indra. Thank you so much for joining us today on Arcx.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I wanted to ask you about your journey as a writer. How did you get started? And did you always want to be a writer?
Yes, from very, very early on. I first started writing when I was a kid in school, around class 7, when we were doing creative writing classes, etc. That's when I was first starting to read more and more books meant for adults. So that really kickstarted my imagination. It was a wonderful step up in terms of the prose, and I was fascinated by the way people use language. So I kind of imitated that in my creative writing classes and wrote these pastiche versions of Michael Crichton or Stephen King. And I remember one time I wrote a little imitation version of Jurassic Park set in China, in this Chinese forest, and these scientists go and discover dinosaurs there and get eaten up by them. I remember using the word gout to describe a spray of blood, because that was a popular word to describe the same in Michael Crichton and Stephen King's works. And I remember being told by the teacher that it was not the correct usage of gout, but she was wrong anyway.
Always good to have a win like that in your pocket.
So basically, at that point, I wrote my first novel, which was kind of in the style of the various epic fantasy writers I was reading at the time, like J.R.R. Tolkien and David Gemmell, Terry Pratchett, etc., all those big writers, because that's what you're kind of exposed to at the time. And so I wrote this fantasy novel called The Shadow Screensaver. And at the time, I was also submitting my work online for the first time ever, because the internet and these burgeoning online magazines, and there were these little fan-run web teams of amateur writers, and one of them, Aphelion, was where I first kind of submitted and quote-unquote published my work, even though this was all no pay, and this was just what you got in return was this little community board where you could participate and people would give you work, kind of feedback on your stories, etc., and you would return the favor. So that was where I first kind of saw my work in quasi-print on the internet, and at the time it seemed like a huge deal. And I'm very grateful for that phase, because, it was a big confidence boost for a teenager, and, I got a lot of good feedback, and it was great, yeah, and it was nice to kind of participate in that little community back in the early days of the internet. Also on the internet, I saw this ad for an Australian publisher, which actually was a vanity press, the kind of printing press that you pay money to and they print your book. And basically that's it. They don't give you any services. And of course, you shouldn't be paying an actual publisher to publish your work. But at the time, I didn't know that, because I was a teenager and completely clueless about the world of publishing. So I ended up paying this press to print my first novel. I think I was 18 at the time. And thankfully, it wasn't a lot of money. Otherwise I wouldn't even have afforded it. But they did print my book, and that was my first kind of crushing wake-up call about the realities of writing and publishing, etc. Because obviously, this book just got printed in a handful of copies in Australia and sat there, only bought by my relatives, because this is not an actual publication. It's vanity printing of the book. So after that, I applied to colleges and ended up going to Franklin Marshall College in the US, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And that's where I took my first creative writing classes, which were wonderful. And that really kind of bolstered the sense that I wanted to keep doing this as a grown up, try to keep doing it. In Franklin Marshall was where I first started technically writing my debut novel, The Devourers, because that's where I wrote the first short stories and novellas that were the seeds of the novel later. And then in my MFA program, when I did my master's in creative writing in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia, that's where I first wrote the first draft of The Devourers as my MFA thesis. And then after I finished the first draft of The Devourers, I stayed on in Canada for a few years on a postgrad work permit, submitted to agents. And it took me a few years after that to get an agent and then get published first in India and then in North America. The Indian edition of The Devourers did not make too much of an impression, but the North American edition is kind of the one people know and the one that kind of garnered me the readership that I do have now, which is not huge, but it is very engaged, very grateful for it because I often hear back from readers of The Devourers, and it always makes me so happy to know that people actually find something meaningful in the world and like it enough to reach out to you. That's always delightful. But yeah, that's a concise version of my journey to where I am now.
It's so nice that you mentioned that there is an aspect of community to it, because from the early internet, I guess MySpace days, where people were talking on forums, and it all felt a lot more innocent and direct than it does now.
Yeah.
You've written mostly in like fantasy, sci-fi spaces. So what drew you to speculative fiction as a whole?
I tend not to be too fond of genre boxing. I don't think of myself as particularly either a science fiction or fantasy writer, even though I've nothing against people using those terms to describe me. But I just write what I want to write, and I would hope that it appeals to anyone, regardless of their affinities in terms of genre. Because I read across tons of genres and I love it all, and realist literature has been as influential to me as speculative fiction. I tend to gravitate towards speculative fiction or non-realist, whatever, science fiction, fantasy, because there's just much more potential for imagination, quite simply. And I tend to enjoy the fact that art can take us to places that we cannot visit in real life, that it can give us experiences that we cannot possibly have in real life. And I kind of equate art to dream because within dreams, you can kind of experience things that are impossible. I regularly witness absolutely awe-inspiring things in my dreams, like cosmic imagery, just witnessing gods and cataclysms, like the ends of planets and multiple moons, spectacular stuff. It's incredible to me that all of humanity has this ability to just kind of wander these strange morphing multiverses in our sleep. And even though many of us don't remember that experience, we all do it. And we spend so much of our lives within those realms. And dreams have always fascinated me in that regard. So I think art is very much kind of humanity's collective dream. Some dreams are mundane and replicating experiences that are very similar day to day life, and other dreams are, the apocalypses and whatever else you can imagine. So it's the same with art and fiction. You have realist fiction and you have fiction that goes absolutely buck wild with the imagination. And I like to mix it up a lot. I like to give a sense of the tactile and the mundane to stories that take place in on other worlds or in other dimensions. Even there, I want there to be a feeling that this is this is real to the people in the story, and that the people are real, and it's not just an assemblage of tropes. Which marketing, especially with science fiction now being this juggernaut marketing force in the world, it's become completely mainstream. And the popular argument when I was growing up that science fiction were the put upon nerds of the literature world. Everyone's making fun of us. No one respects us. That doesn't hold water anymore. Like sure, there's you can come back to the respectability debate, etc., hierarchies of art value, etc. But ultimately, geeks won. Like these billionaires that are destroying our planet are geeks. They're very much self-professed fans of science fiction. And so, there's no inherent moral value in any genre. And this argument seesaws a lot where you see a kind of snobbery from genre fans as well, where they'll say, realism is just about college professors sleeping with their students and there's nothing else to read. And so you've got the same kind of diminishing of an entire genre, which is these genres are marketing terms. You have so much overlap and slippage, and that's what ultimately love about art, that it is fluid, that it can take many, many shapes and forms, and it's a hybrid thing at all times. And I like mushing those genres together. That's what really fascinates me when you have works that are hard to categorize. And that's not to say I don't love works that are easy to categorize as well. Like I grew up with fantasy fiction in that mold, Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, etc., which are very easily categorized, but also key formative works for me. And I deeply love those works for what they gave me at the time. I will still read books that are easily slotted into genres, but I think nowadays where I really gravitate to is the spaces between, where everything kind of blends in together.
So you mentioned formative stories, and I was just wondering, were there any books or TV shows or films that you felt have really influenced you as a storyteller?
Yes, and many, many books and TV shows and movies. One of those that immediately springs to mind is Stephen King's It, which was, again, one of the earliest books that I read as a teenager that was kind of mammoth and meant for adults. And it's that quality of it that kind of, it's so huge and epic and all encompassing, and it kind of delves into the lives of these children. And I was so absorbed in it. It just kind of, it became like a second life I was living during the summer that I was reading it. And at the time, it didn't even, I remember I was so young when I first started reading it. I didn't even fully grasp that much of the timeline of the book was set in the 50s. And instead, I just kind of imagined it as this timeless fusion of both America and my time and place, because these children were so relatable, like these children were so real to me. And of course, the language as well, over the top, overwrought, but also so immersive style really, really took me in. And so that was one of the books that really made me want to be a writer. But it was also The Lord of the Rings. And also, I should mention this because The Devourers ends up being about shapeshifters. The first Stephen King book that I ever read was The Cycle of the Werewolf, which is this illustrated novella with beautiful, beautiful paintings by Bernie Wrightson. And I remember finding it at the book fair and asked my parents to get it. And they did, even though paintings were extremely gory. But I think that the language in that book, that describing werewolves, these impossible creatures, describing them in such a tactile fashion. I remember King using the words cinnamon to describe the smell of the werewolves as they approach. That has always stuck with me. And I think, that book definitely a debt of great gratitude for the subtle influence it would have later in terms when I gravitated back to monsters and impossible creatures in my work, because there was always that I keep coming back to that sense of tactility, which brings you into the reality of the book. And even though The Devourers isn't really in the style of Stephen King at all, I think that little kind of seed laid by the cycle of the werewolf remained. And there's also in college, I remember Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli movies being a massive, massive kind of revelation to me because I'd never seen anime until that point. And I think, again, this wasn't a conscious influence when I was writing The Devourers, but when I look back, it's so evident when I see the scenes of Sira riding this giant shapeshifter through the forest. It's the influence of Miyazaki's work is so clear, with the emphasis on godlike megafauna and their relationship with humans. And also just Miyazaki and all the Studio Ghibli directors, and really anime in general, there's this kind of a unique way of binding the mundane with the magical, where there's an emphasis on the rituals of daily life and also the details of daily life. You have these shots that are kind of reflecting on nature and just the environment and houses, just like almost like still photography, and also the relationships between families. And that was always really wonderful to me, that it made the magic seem so much more real because you have these very textured everyday lives brought to life in such a tremendously affecting way. So yeah, I think Miyazaki was always a really big influence to me as well.
It's so interesting that you say Stephen King's It in particular, because to me, that's like a classic horror setup. Just the idea of this, it's kind of seared into my brain, that first bit where George, I think, is the one floating his paper boat.
Oh yeah, such a vivid scene, the little kid brother's death.
Yes, just the kind of visualization of seeing a clown, which, now I think a lot of us associate clowns with a certain amount of horror. I certainly do. I hate them. But I don't know how much of that is because of Pennywise, by the way. But I just, I remember thinking, like, when you were a child, a clown it's supposed to be a source of joy and entertainment. And of course, he put his hand through the grate. Like, of course, he thought he was safe. It's such an ominous start to this saga.
Yeah.
It is one of those great openings.
And in that scene, again, what I keep coming back to after all these years, I haven't read that book since I read it as a child. But what I keep coming back to so vividly are the little details, the sensory details, where the big brother is kind of making the little paper boat for his little brother, and he's using that wax. And King describes the smell of the wax and the picture of the turtle on the case of the wax. And of course, that it connects back to the mythology later, but at the time it's just this with detail. And I thought it was all so vividly brought to life, and the mother playing the piano in the background, the rain outside, the vividness of the yellow raincoat against the blood that kind of comes out of the little brother's body when the arm is ripped off. It's stuck in my head and just clinging there like these little bits of paper in a gutter. It's marvelous, really.
When you talk about Miyazaki as well, I mean, I think you've kind of nailed the things that I find the most fascinating about those films. And especially because when you watch them, I think as an adult, when you're introspecting a bit more, they do tackle some really huge themes.
Very much so. I only ever watched them as an adult. I never saw any anime as a child. And I think they're absolutely the best children's movies are also for adults. They work on an equal level, and Studio Ghibli movies are very much in that mold, even when they're really serious. Because there is this visual appeal, and there's these usually cute animals, but it's also very much about mortality and the fallibility of humans and how terrifying the world is. All Studio Ghibli movies eventually are about growing up, which I guess a lot of children's movies are, but they really tackle the brutality of the world in a way that's very head on.
Absolutely. And I think also I'm from a generation where there were a lot of Disney movies, and then you were used to seeing a very neatly wrapped up happily ever after, which is not what you get here. I did watch some of these movies as a child, and I remember thinking, no, I'm not used to this kind of conclusion. And now, as an adult, rewatching them, especially during the pandemic, I was like, God, they were so pragmatic and real about it. I think also some of the themes like climate change and stuff really went over my head as a child. And now I'm like, yep, makes sense.
Yeah, Studio Ghibli movies are very often about the clash of human civilization and quote unquote progress with nature and living in balance with ecosystems. And that's all so very sadly relevant. And they're also about war. Nausicaa and Princess Mononoke, very much about the scars war leaves on the earth and on humans.
Are there any themes in these movies that you've explored in your work or, that you'd want to explore in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I also keep coming back to these essential themes of humanity and nature and our troubled relationship. I think that's very prominent in Miyazaki's movies and Studio Ghibli movies in general, and it's quite prominent in my work as well, especially The Devourers. The way that we are animals living within an ecosystem and that we've kind of consciously sundered ourselves from that ecosystem and we've become these godlike creatures in terms of the power we wield, but we are also completely helpless to confront how much damage that power that does both to us and the rest of the world. That's why we also keep coming back to gods in our stories, because gods are this manifestation of our own power, the power to imagine, the power to narrativize, the power to create a machinery of the world, social and technological machinery that essentially changes the world, that, absolutely transforms the planet that we're living on in such a way that we cause these literal biblical plagues that we're seeing now, just rising seas, superstorms, plagues, diseases, pandemics, we're terrified by our own abilities and our own powers, and we're also terrified by our animal existence, the fact that we're animals. We're disgusted by our bodies in a way that other animals aren't. We're disgusted by the way we procreate. We're disgusted by the fact that we find pleasure in that procreation. So it's all very, very conflicted and kind of twisted up in these myths we make. And I think in Miyazaki's movies, gods play a huge part, these giant creatures actually witnessing and having relationships with these godlike animals is a big thing. And they're kind of our idealized selves in a way, but also representing the terror that we feel for ourselves, when we're confronted with these creatures in movies like Spirited Away, when the scene with the dragon, where the dragon boy turns into the dragon and the protagonist kind of has to calm the dragon down. I mean, it's absolutely seared into my brain, the beauty of that scene where the dragon kind of flashes into the sky and crashes back to the earth and it's covered in blood, and this little child is trying to contain its fear and fury. And it was just such a remarkable scene. And I think you see the influence of that very, very strongly in The Devourers, with all these scenes where Sira, this human woman, is kind of trying to hold her own against these gigantic, godlike shapeshifters who can tear her apart in seconds.
Before we really get into The Devourers, which I'm eager to do, I wanted to ask you if you could maybe do a small reading from the book.
This piece of the novel is from the beginning, a little after the beginning, where our protagonist, the college professor, Alok, He meets a stranger at a Baul Mala who claims that he's a half werewolf and tells him a story that kind of draws Alok in this hypnotic trance. So I'm going to read a bit from that story, which is being narrated by the stranger who claims he's a half werewolf. To set the stage, I must tell you where I was, he says. It is very dark. I listen. Think of a field, a swamp, rather. This is a long time ago. Kolkata, Calcutta, or what will be Calcutta. Maybe it is this very field, this very ground. It is different then, overgrown and marshy, the hum and tickle of insects like a grainy blanket over this winter night. It is cloudy, the moonlight diffuse as it sparkles on the stretches of water hiding under the reeds. The darkness is oppressive. There is no blush of electricity on the horizon, no vast cities for the sky to reflect. Somewhere beyond the dark, there are three villages, Kalikata, Sutanati, Govindapur. They belong to the British East India Company. They are building a fort known as William. Things are changing. A new century nears. It will be the 18th by the Christian calendar. The campfire is an oasis of light. The bowls gather around, flames glistening on their dark, swamp-damp skins, twinkling in their beards. They sing to ward off the encroaching darkness, their words lifting with the wood sparks toward the stars. They sing, unheeding of signatures on paper, of land exchanges and politics, of the white traders and their tensions with the Nawab and the Mughal Empire. Here in the firelight, they make music and tell stories to one another, to the land, to Bengal, which does not belong to them, nor to the British, nor the Mughals. They know that there are things in the wilderness that neither Mughal nor white man has in his documents of ownership, things to be found in stories. And again, they also claim to be mad. I watch the bowls. I can see the others in the gloom, crouched amid the reeds, circling slowly. More approach from afar, their claws sinking into the mud. I can hear them, though, the rustle of their spined fur, the twisting of rushes against their backs. A howl slices the dark. The bowls falter, but continue singing, holding tight to their instruments and gnarled staves. I can hear the mosquitoes whining around them, alighting on knuckles, popping against skin, gorging, dying in the heat of the fire. There's a young woman amid this group of traveling bowls. She looks out into the darkness, the words of their song dissolving on her tongue. Her hair is so black it melts into the night. I remember the taste of her lips, moist but cool from the night air. She keeps her eyes beyond the borders of the fire, searching a wilderness stirred into sentience by the noises of insect and animal, cricket and cockroach, moth and mosquito, snake and mongoose, fox and field rat, jackal and wildcat. Her bright patchwork cloak is wrapped tight around her body, marking her out. She is tired, short, and unarmed, and stands no chance of surviving the attack. Not that the others do either. I can smell her terror like sweat against the gritty spice of wood smoke. The wet soil of the marsh is cold between my toes. The insects catch in my fur, wrestling it, tickling like the reeds and plants around me. The woman knows we are here, beyond their firelight. She knows because I told her myself, as a young man with long hair and kind eyes, tiger pelt on my back. She heard me and saw me, though she slept while I whispered in her ear. More of us come from the horizon, the scent of cow's blood, the slaughter on their muzzles. They have eaten, but their hunt is not over. Their eyes weave trails as they run, leaping fireflies, tracking their loping gait. They flank the group of humans, cutting off escape. The full moon watches through the clouds, eager for massacre. With a bark of exhaled air, the clatter of tusk on fang, we spring. The bowl's song is loud and beautiful in its imperfection. It is their last. I run with my pack, my tribe. The boughs are surrounded. They sing till the very last moment. The first kill is silent as our running, a glistening whisper of crimson in the air. The last is louder than the baying of a wolf, and rings like the boughs' mad song across the marshes of what is not yet Kolkata. I can hear the howl as I run with this human in my arms, into the darkness, away from the shadows of slaughter. The howl curdles into a roar, enveloping the scream of the last dying minstrel. But she is alive, against me, shivering against my dew-dappled fur. She is alive.
Thank you. That was lovely.
Thank you.
The Devourers, in the best way possible, is one of the most unique books that I've ever. Can you tell us a bit about what inspired the concept and how did you go about putting it together?
Yeah, so of course, there's many things that kind of come together to inspire a book, and you can't always narrow them down. But there is a certain very distinct incident that triggered the ideas for this book, which was during college when I was visiting back home in Kolkata during winter break. I went to a Baal Mala, like the one that opens the book. I went with a few friends, and at the time, this was, of course, a long time ago, the Baal Mala was not very commercialized, and there was just tons of people there kind of smoking up, drinking, enjoying the music, exactly as it's described in the book. In this open field at midnight with the bows singing in this tent. And so we were very intoxicated and kind of in this trance with the music, much like Alok in the opening scene. And this little kitten in the field came up to us, came up to me, and hid by my feet. And there was this pack of street dogs hunting it, kind of stalking it around the crowd. So I kind of protected the kitten for the duration of my stay at the field. And with the music and the lights and the fact that it was a winter night with mist, and it just kind of set my mind wandering across time. And I wondered what it might be like to be in that spot hundreds of years earlier at a campfire in the darkness, surrounded by this mist with no idea what's in the darkness, including any kind of monster. And I did, perhaps because of the stray dogs and also because of the things I've read, I did keep coming back to werewolves, the shapeshifters, creatures hiding in the dark. So I had this vision there of first scene of the book. And when I went back to college, I wrote that first scene as a short story. And that eventually turned into the first chapter of the book. So that was a pretty clear kind of evolution of the beginning of the novel. And then there were, of course, various other influences. Part of the process of writing the novel was also when in university I looked back on that short story and I asked myself, why werewolf? Why did you write about werewolves in Kolkata? Why use this European myth within your hometown, within your native country? And the novel is kind of like an elaborate answer to that. And, why would werewolves be India? What would they be doing there? What is the reason for it? So the novel kind of answers that, which, if you've read the book. And I think part of the reason that I gravitated to werewolves is partly because it's Cycle of the Werewolves, that was one of the first adult books I read, but also because The Sandman, which has an issue that is about immortal werewolves in Eastern Europe, and from the point of view of a child being narrated the story of their werewolf family by her grandfather. I think that had a strong influence on me, certainly when I was writing that original short story, because there is this kind of Gaiman-esque sense of history and myth and characters looking back across time, and also immortals, beings kind of wistfully moving through centuries and in a lonesome way. Those were kind of the primary influences. But while I was writing the book, there's hundreds of different things that had an impression on me and went into the book, including Invisible Cities, Jeanette Winterson, Virginia Woolf's Orlando, Anne Carson's The Autobiography of Red, various things. The last, Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ, that was a big one actually when I was writing the book because I watched the movie at that time. And the soundtrack was a key part of my writing the book, Peter Gabriel's soundtrack for that movie. It was like a background thing, constant when I was writing the book. But also the movie itself and the way it's about human and humans communicating with the ineffable, but being trapped within these carnal bodies, and the way human frailty transforms into myth. I think it was beautifully done. And obviously, I'm not Christian or Catholic or religious in any way. I'm an atheist, but I think spirituality resonates with me because the way that I'm spiritual is through art, through really just interacting with the universe, which I find absolutely incredible and astonishingly beautiful and awe inspiring, and with our imaginations, which are, of course, part of the universe. I'm very fascinated by the way humans keep trying to communicate with the universe that is much, much vaster than them, and which essentially leaves them feeling very isolated while also divorcing ourselves from the community that we have on this planet with other life forms. It's very interesting and naughty.
I think the two themes that I really noticed in the book, as you mentioned, loneliness and also love in very different variations and really across the spectrum, and not necessarily healthy love. But at the same time, to me, those were the two things that stood out the most. Was that kind of a conscious decision on your part?
I don't think anything is a conscious decision for me when I'm writing. I mean, the themes just kind of organically come out. And I also wouldn't want to be prescriptive in reading my work. I wouldn't want to tell people the ways in which to gain meaning from it. But yeah, it's definitely very much about love. Loneliness in a more diffuse sense. So when I was writing it, I didn't consider it to be a portrait of loneliness in the way some novels are. But of course it is eventually. I mean, at least in terms of, no, and in terms of all the protagonists, actually, Sira, Alok, and the shapeshifters as well, because they are all kind of isolated in their own ways by their own relations to their own communities. And of course, with Alok, it's also to do with being stigmatized for his queerness. And with Sira, it's to do with being poor and the sex worker. And with the shapeshifters, it's to do with, or at least with Fenrir, and Javondon, it's to do with wanting to be more human, which is kind of forbidden thing within their tribal communities as shapeshifters because human beings are prey. But the shapeshifters get their whole identity from kind of consuming human beings, their souls, and their cultures as well. The shapeshifters define themselves according to human mythology. So we have these tribes calling themselves werewolves or jinns or rakushas, etc. So yeah, there is very much that sense of loneliness throughout it as well, and love as a way, as a constant again within human communities, because there's again that sense of dislocation with the rest of the world, which comes back around to being funneled into this concept that we have of love, of connecting with other human beings. But even that is so difficult for us in so many ways because we have so much trouble reconciling fluidity within ourselves, fluidity, the way in which people are different. People aren't this homogenous kind of idea we have of each other. So I think it always comes back to being essentially clueless, the way human beings are forever kind of afraid and wanting succor from that fear.
Also, I noticed which I found quite fascinating, is the kind of thread of otherness to all the characters, because you have 5 people who you've kind of focused on pretty exclusively in the book. And to me, they're all some version of other, whether it's the shapeshifters who kind of choose to be other. They don't want to be human. In fact, human is kind of horrifying to them. But even Tira and Alok, there's a sort of way that they're apart from society or conformity, really. And I found that really interesting.
Yeah, and that definitely comes down to why this is essentially a queer novel. It's about the ways in which nonconformity can be terrifying and lonely, but can also be a path to finding others. And of course, now, found family is one of the terms that has been kind of driven into the ground by various discourses, by pop cultural discourse. But this book is again kind of about that, though not, as you mentioned, not a healthy family, because the connections all of these characters make are with essentially dangerous entities or people, and they do end up kind of alone in the end again, but with perhaps a path forward in a way to envision their own otherness as themselves, as being true to themselves and being true to how they perceive themselves.
The power dynamics in the book also were very interesting and I thought quite layered, because when you start out, you kind of think of the shapeshifters as this kind of unstoppable force. And Sira, well, she fits a victim stereotype to begin with. And then as the novel progresses, you really see her come into her own in a very different way. And I mean, not to be too spoilery, but at the end, I feel like she maybe was the character with the most agency. She made a very deliberate choice to live the way she did and to end the way she did.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, with Sierra, it was that whole character arc and the whole narrative kind of becomes the heart of the book, was also me interrogating my younger self, because the little section where the shapeshifters are gathered around near the Taj Mahal and where Sira gets raped by Fenrir, that was written in college in a very different form. It was written in college as a little novella or novelette. So in that version of the story, Sira is not seen very much. She's just seen in the scene where Fenrir comes to the caravanserai and takes her by force. When I look back on that later, when I was writing the novel, and I look back at this and thought of my intent behind that, like just to confront masculine violence, but in a way that gives no agency to the woman, that's wanted to unpack that, to unpack the ways in which we're conditioned to see women as powerless, to replicate these cycles of violence. And so Zira giving her primary role in the novel came from that. And that really opened up the novel, because I was stuck for a long time when I was trying to write the novel, just from the point of view of Alok and Fenrir, and then wondering, how do I open this up? And then it was so obvious it has to be from Sierra's viewpoint. And it was important to me not to get rid of her vulnerability, because she is frail and she is also a victim and a survivor of violence. And she is small and very easily damaged in comparison to these gigantic magical animals that she is kind of traveling with and confronting, which makes her strength all the more, which makes her resilience through the novel all the more interesting to me. I wanted her to be this frighteningly vulnerable and fragile figure who nonetheless finds the strength to carry on in this world that is incredibly brutal and misogynistic and patriarchal. In the book, it's very much in this kind of dreamlike sense. where she is completely trapped. She's surrounded by these literal monsters that take masculine shape. She has no other people. She's all alone. So, yeah, it's very much kind of a compression of this microcosm of a patriarchal world in a dreamlike sense.
One of the most striking parts of the novel for me is when these two shapeshifters, who are kind of titans, go at each other in battle in Fatehpur Sikri, which is a brilliant setting when you think about it. And she's kind of lying there helpless, unable to throw her favor in any way. Like she's just kind of there while they battle over her.
She's a trophy almost, yeah.
Yes, and they battle over her. And then comes this conversation between her and Fenrir, which is really a kind of flipping of the narrative for me. I think that's where I start to see her as a person emerge, because she denies him what he wants the most, which is he wants to be thought of as this person who created something beautiful. And she kind of brings him down to reality in a very brutal way.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I think the progression of her relationship with Javada is kind of lovely, though it starts in a very suspect, later realize his motives are a bit crazy. But there is a sense of mutual respect, which I think lends itself so much to her character in general, because his respect for her kind of makes you wonder what she has going on and what, she is going to become, which I thought was really fascinating.
I think the moment where she kind of denies Henry his narrative of creating beauty and of loving her, sadly, you see this kind of courage every day now on the internet, on social media, where you have these women and non-binary people just attacked non-stop by these monstrous, cruelish people, and it's just endless. It's endless. And you see these journalists, activists, etc., have to take all this with such dignity and strike down these trolls. It's just such a shame that this is forever relevant. And when I wrote this notion of the troll, the online troll, was not so fully formed. Social media wasn't where it is now. It wasn't this massive part of the world. Facebook was definitely a huge thing, but Twitter had yet to take off. We had yet WhatsApp didn't even exist, nor did Snapchat, TikTok, etc. And so, but when you look back on it, Fenrir is absolutely this kind of mythic manifestation of an incel or a troll, in that he creates this narrative of victimization, even though he is immensely powerful and very much the attacker in the scenario. It's interesting to look back on that and to recognize Fenrir so clearly every day when I log on to social media.
And I also strangely think of him as the most passive character, because he kind of, like you said, victimizes himself quite a bit. And also, he acts like he had nothing to do with how this has played out. Like, oh, another person in my pack has been murdered by a fellow packmate. I'm going to bury him and move on because that's all I can do. I was not really involved in this, you know?
Yeah. Which is, again, this kind of dynamic you see with internet trolls as well. Any weakness amongst themselves and they will eat each other alive. And it's always this transference of blame. They will harass people, bully people, abuse people, and then blame the victim. And it's not just, of course, I'm simplifying it down to the internet troll, which is just a manifestation of what happens in real life as well, of course, all the time. It's essentially up, down in every strata of our society. It's patriarchy. And which is not to say it's only men doing this. It's a majoritarian privilege, of course. Everyone is capable of it and everyone does it. It's just mostly men because of the power dynamics of our societies.
And I think that as you mentioned, the patriarchy is something that runs quite strongly through the novel, like the idea of this kind of generational misogyny almost, because it is set in such different times. You're looking at Mughal India, there's mentions of Shah Jahan, and then the next minute you are in contemporary Kolkata. And at the same time, you do get a sense that across time and space, people who don't conform still experience that huge sense of loneliness and victimization.
Yeah, very much so. I wanted it to be clear that we really shouldn't have very much of superiority complex about how far we've come. And because as we can see now, however many years it's been since I wrote the novel, everything is capable of being taken away, any progress. We don't pay enough attention to the way we let these hatreds fester, and then it just all takes over again. It's also cyclical, and it's more than cyclical. Now we're just actively kind of barging backwards in every degree. And when we're barging forwards, it's towards catastrophe and destruction. I wanted there to be the sense of these empires falling, and all of it is transient. Nothing remains forever. And no matter how strong you feel at the moment, it's all coming down because we're all subject to human folly, essentially. And of course, more simply, to mortality.
I wanted to also discuss Alok, who I found very compelling because he's a very contemporary and recognizable character to me and very grounded in today. Why was it important to you to have that perspective in the book?
I think because I wanted a grounding, as you say, in contemporary life and also just the kind of standard fantasy tool of having a straight man to your fantastical goings on, who's like your entry point into the story by the way he reacts, etc. This is especially kind of necessary in this novel. I don't want to say necessary, but it helps in this novel because Fenrir is a viewpoint character, the first viewpoint character right after Alok's frame narrative. And Fenrir is a rapist, and his viewpoint is very much of justifying his violence towards Sira. And, the narrative is very much not hiding that. He is very much of the idea that he is completely justified in committing this rape, and he kind of romanticizes it and glorifies into this mythology almost. So you have a lot of readers being horrified by that, obviously, and also taking it at face value and stopping reading the book, which, fair enough. But again, I have to insist this is something people often lose grasp of in these times with discourse. Authors do not represent the actions of their characters. So Alok is useful in that regard, that he reacts to Fenrir's narrative right after that by essentially calling it out, by saying this is absolutely horrifying. Are we supposed to sympathize with this character? And then, of course, the stranger tells him, that's up to you. that's for you to decide whether or not you sympathize with the character or not. Because the stranger is also, of course, a very amoral character. But yeah, generally, Alok is a framing character. His journey doesn't really come into play until towards the end of the book. Before that, he's essentially just a medium for the rest of the story. And then once those nested stories are over, that's when we see the effect that the stranger and the mythologies that he's trailing has on his own self-realization as a queer and non-binary person.
I also found the stranger's journey very compelling because, in a way, he's kind of an experiment. Genetically, he's an abomination, and at least to his own kind. He grows up in ignorance of his heritage and obviously embraces the shapeshifter way. But through his actions, he becomes an even bigger abomination to his kind, which I found kind of ironic and sad. But at the end of it, his human side, which is, I think, what helps him connect with Alok, and also what Fenrir really valued so much, is holds a lot of sway, which I found very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, essentially the shapeshifters are humans, of course. They're constructs that are born of magical thinking. This isn't like a traditional Western shape werewolf stories where it's a disease or something that literally kind of changes your body. In the book, in The Devourers, it's very kind of mythic and you don't really exactly see how they change. It's more a sense of the inexplicable, of something utterly ineffable. They're not actually wolves or, whatever else. They're just these constructs of magic. They're gods, essentially, and gods are human, as because they're born from humans, as William Blake put it, all gods spring from the breast of man. I think that was the quote, I forget. The poetry of William Blake was a huge, huge influence on the Devourers as well. The sense of humanity being an emanation of the divine, even if you're not religious, because the divine is a human construct. There's the sense of this eternal circle, which I find so fascinating. And also Blake's whole notion of not buying into the whole good and evil binary, the breakdown of binaries, even though he uses binaries in his work a lot. And the whole binary of the devouring and the creative taken straight from his work, which the shapeshifters use as a kind of visualization, or Fenrir does. The shapeshifters essentially are human, which is why the stranger comes back to his human self eventually, because that's what he is. All this, the shapeshifters talk of bloodlines and, of remaining pure, of being this whole taboo against commingling with humans. It's all nonsense, essentially, like it's all made up. It's mythology. And in the end, that all falls away. It reveals the stranger for what he is, which is a human being. Or he disappears into the ether as mythology and remains within that realm. It's not clear because it's all tied together. It's all fluid, which is what I keep coming back to, of course. We are far more fluid than we ever give ourselves credit for in terms of our sexualities, our genders, our mythologies, our cultures. It all runs together. And unfortunately, this human impulse to kind of deny that, to deny our fluidity, to kind of slash everything into pieces and into binaries, into one thing or the other, is ultimately what hurts us so catastrophically, both on an intimate and a civilizational scale.
I find it very compelling that you mentioned Blake, because there is such a strong element of mysticism through his work and through this novel as well. And I couldn't help but think of fate at the end of the novel, because to me, suddenly all these things came together and you feel like Sira finally got her revenge, but in the most, I suppose, most appropriate way. And was that something you were working towards from the beginning?
No, definitely not. My writing process is always very, very unplanned. So everything just kind of sprouted organically like a tree from one branch to another. The fact that Sira becomes Bone Bibi, this literal goddess, without actually becoming divine in the sense that the shapeshifters are, was not planned at all. But when they arrive at the Shumdur Bones, I thought, of course, this is incredible that we have this woman who is riding on the back of this gigantic beast and has a child just like Bone Bibi. So I thought it was absolutely perfect. And it just kind of clicked into place. And of course, she has to become Bone Bibi. She has to become this protector of the forest. And it was even more ideal because Bone Bibi is kind of this syncretic deity who is worshipped by both Hindus and Muslims in the Sundarbans. It was just beautiful. I was so happy when I came across that idea of making her own baby, this is absolutely perfect. The further phase where she kind of sacrifices herself to her son, to a shapeshifter, for which is again something that has never been done. A human becoming a willing sacrifice for a shapeshifter creates this new mythology where she essentially lives on within the shapeshifter with a sense of agency. So that was affected very much by The Last Temptation of Christ, the Scorsese movie, and the fact of Christ, when he sacrifices himself, he lives on in a way that is very, very palpable. He creates this new myth. And that is what Sira does, essentially, is create a new myth that gives her immortality.
Also, she at some point expresses interest in becoming a shapeshifter herself, and that never really happens. She makes a choice to stay human. Why is that?
Again, I wouldn't want to be prescriptive. I don't like describing for other people what they should take away from the characters. For me, I just saw it as a moment of very understandable weakness where she feels utterly alone and fragile and human. She has no one in the world, and being a shapeshifter is being a god. So, of course, she would want that. That is something all humans at some point in their lives will want, whether or not they're conscious of it, to be more powerful. In fact, that's probably something humans want at every moment of their lives, whether or not they admit it.
I also wanted to ask because, well, a lot of this is about her keeping the baby, who eventually becomes the stranger. It's not really a choice. She's terrified from the beginning. The stranger is actually born of an act of huge violence. But also the kind of mythology that Fenrir has about creating life, of this kind of romanticized idea of what motherhood is, which he tries to push onto her. I mean, I must say it feels extra appropriate reading it now in the times we live in, but I couldn't stop thinking about it.
Yeah, so of course, that again comes right back down to patriarchy. And if we're kind of being succinct, a mythology to control women's bodies and selves. And that is exactly what Fenrir is all about. He believes that once he rapes Sira, she belongs to him, which is sadly a notion that millions of men, and not just men, millions of people all around the world still seem to believe. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned her keeping the baby and the fact that she doesn't really have a choice. I didn't want it to come across as a pro-life quote unquote message. I didn't want it to seem like, oh, you shouldn't have an abortion. I mean, this is of course taking place in the Mughal Empire, where getting an abortion would be, I presume, extremely difficult. And also because, as you say, she's terrified right from the beginning. She doesn't know what's going on. The main thrust of her journey is that she wants to find the person or the entity that did this violence to her and get some kind of consequences for it, and see if via that entity's magic the baby can somehow magically be taken away. But of course, that doesn't come to pass. That is why she has the baby. It's not because she wants to have the baby. Absolutely not. And yes, after the baby is born, she has regrets. That's all to do with human fluidity again. We're not just one person in our life, we're many people. And there are many points at which Sira thinks she should have been a mother to her child, and there are other points at which she thinks she absolutely made the right decision. So, yes, it's very complex. And the reason she goes back to her son to sacrifice herself is essentially because she remains alone, because she's become a goddess. She's basically transcended human society and she has nowhere to go. And so she makes this decision to kind of join with the myth that she's become and become immortal.
And I think that's a really wonderful way at looking at immortality also, because I think a lot of people think that legacy and having a child is a kind of immortality.
Very much so, yeah.
That's not really the way I think that she looks at it. She was in control of her own immortality in that sense, which is wonderful.
To whatever degree that she could be, because we're never in control, essentially. And I think she takes a big gamble and it kind of pays off, but only because of the effect that she's had on her son. Her son is the one that carries forward this legacy and this mythology and this story of her life and kind of is the caretaker of it so that she can become immortal. So her son kind of becomes a priest in essence of her final form as this divinity to him.
Yeah. And I mean, to be clear, I'm not saying wonderful in the sense that this is the ideal ending for a strong woman.
Of course, yeah.
Just to be clear, I was not condoning the eating of others, eating your mother, as it were. So on a lighter note, wrapping up, I also wanted to ask what you think happens to Alok.
Alok lived his life. I mean, once again, I do not want to be prescriptive. That is completely up to the reader. And as many readers have pointed out, the ending is extremely ambiguous. You can take it in any way you feel. You can take it as the stranger having consumed Alok and Alok becoming one with the myriad of lives within the stranger, or you can take it as the stranger literally leaving and Alok continuing with his life, or the stranger becoming Alok after consuming him, and therefore all of them existing as one thing. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. The point is that fluidity is what dominates our existences, despite our civilizational urge to put boxes and to put lines around everything, to create binaries, to divide. Alok realized that he is non binary and lives his life. Of course, he doesn't have that language at that point. Alok has been read as a trans woman as well, and that could also be the case. It's up to the reader. The point is that Alok does not conform to the gender that he was assigned at birth, does not conform to the person that other people who have rejected him see him as, and is a fluid being that self realizes at the end of the book.
I think the impression I got personally was just that there were now doors open to him, both mentally and physically, that weren't before.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
A lot of that was the stranger and the story that he's a part of now, whether he's been consumed or not. It's just full of possibility for him.
Transformation, of course, is what, to simplify again, so much of what all these stories are about. That's what Alok realizes, that he can transform, whether or not other people want him to, whether or not his culture wants him to, whether or not society perceives him as the way he wants to be perceived. He can do so himself. And that can be painful, not having others perceive that, but at least he has his own vision as well.
That's a great way to think of it, I think. And to wrap up, what can we expect from you in 2022 and 2023? Is there anything new coming out? What should we look out?
Yes, I can't go into details because it's not announced yet, but I do have a novella coming out soon in book form, and I'm very proud of it, and I'm excited for that to go out into the world. But since it hasn't been announced yet, I can't talk about it. And there are a few other projects that have also not been announced, but I do also have some stories that have recently been published in different books, including a horror story called Here Comes Your Man in Ellen Datlow's Screams from the Dark anthology, published by Tor Nightfire. It's an anthology of horror stories about monsters and the monstrous, and my story is kind of this home invasion story set in Shantiniketan. It's kind of like a psychological horror spin on straw dogs almost. There's also my story, a science fiction story, kind of Miyazaki-esque, about a child being adopted by the pilot of a mecha in future Kolkata, in a future reforesting Kolkata in the age of plagues when there's tons of pandemics and global warming, etc. It's really reached a breaking point, and so cities are being forested, and there's these mechas being used in service of all of that, of transforming the landscapes of cities. The story is called A Necessary Being, and it was published in the anthology Makeshift from MIT Press, edited by Gideon Litchfield. That came out in 2019, I think, and it's part of the 12 Tomorrows science fiction anthology series. And of course, there's several other short stories you can read in various books and online magazines if you just search my name or go to my website.
Thank you. I look forward to being scared out of my wits. Those all sound wonderfully terrifying.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
It was great having you on Arcx. Thanks. You can follow Indra on Twitter at Indra Pramit Das. Arcx is a series of the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagining futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or at darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.